on, Craig?
Pardon me?
Are we recording today?
Yes, and it looks like it's going.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm recording it now. I'm Alexandra from Budget Office.
Great. Okay, I see the mark now. Okay, with that, I will open up the hearing. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm convening a hearing of the Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission. We are holding this hearing today to discuss Measure 26-213, a measure that the city has put on the November ballot. The commission is a neutral body in this manner, and we conduct this hearing for the public's benefit. Because it will be decided by the voters in November, the commission will not take any formal action on today's meeting. We will just be holding the hearing. With that, my name is David Berenger, and I'm the chair of the Tax Supervising Commission. And I'd like to have my fellow commissioners introduce themselves, and the staff too, please.
Good afternoon. I'm James Ofsang-Keyham, Vice Chair of TSCC. This is my 5th year with the Commission. So more than 5th time getting to speak with you all because of the ballot measures as well. And when I'm not doing this Commission opportunity, I work at OHSU.
Good afternoon. I'm Margot Norton. I'm also in my 5th year on the commission. I live in Northeast Portland and right smack between Grant Park and Wilshire Park. I am a retired government finance officer.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Wobold, and this is my 4th year with the TSCC. I'm also a Northeast Portlander, close to the Kennedy McMinimans, lovely Concordia neighborhood. And my day job is I'm Senior Policy Analyst for the President of Portland State University.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Harmony Kidos. This is my 1st year as a member of the TSCC, so very nice to meet all of you or see you again since the spring budget hearings. I was a former teacher and currently work in science curriculum and assessment development, and I also have 2 small children. We are avid parks users.
Hello, everyone. My name is Craig Gibbons, and I'm the staff to the commission.
Tony Betchart, staff.
Great, thank you. With that, will the city representatives please introduce themselves?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. I'm Portland City Commissioner Amanda Fritz. I'm in charge of Portland Parks and Recreation again.
Good afternoon. I'm Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, and I will apologize for having to leave probably before we are done.
Good afternoon. Chloe Daly, Portland City Commissioner.
Good afternoon. Dan Ryan, Portland City Commissioner.
Great. Thank you. Any of the staff would like to introduce themselves? No? All right. With that, thank you all for attending our meeting. Would the city like to provide some brief overview of the measure for us, please?
Thank you. I would like to provide a brief overview of the measure. This is a 5-year local option levy measure that would allow Portland Parks and Recreation to maintain parks, natural areas and trails at current levels and allow us to do preventative tree maintenance for the first time. If approved, levy funds would deliver recreational programs, including but not limited to community centers and pool operations, community food access and nutrition programs, environmental education, summer camps, youth employment opportunities for youth to connect with nature, and funds to care for Portland's trees. Additional funds would allow parks to reduce cost for the public to participate in its offerings. Specific projects and items will be determined through a range of factors, including an equity lens and assessment of the most critical needs in the park system, other available funds, and community input. We put this measure on the ballot in fairly short order once it was clear that COVID was having such a big input. So we didn't have as much community input before referring it. And if it passes, we will have some more extended community input on exactly what it will be used for afterwards. The levy would have a community oversight committee appointed to review levy expenditures. That committee would report annually to City Council and the public. The levy would be audited annually to ensure that services and programs funded by the levy are consistent with voter intent. The proposed levy of 80 cents per 1,000 of assessed value would raise approximately $48 million per year for 5 years. A homeowner with a home assessed valued at $200,000, which is just a little bit above Portland's median value, would pay about $151 a year, or about $13 a month.
Great. Thank you very much for that overview. With that, we will begin our questions, and if there are any public comments, we will take them after our formal questions. I have the first question. So my question is about kind of the history of how we got to the state that we're at today. How did we get there, and why does the Portland Park and Recreation, why does Portland Park and Recreation have such a structural deficit? And what are the top 3 causes of the structural deficit?
Yeah, thank you for the question. During the development of the last budget, the 2019-20 budget, Commissioner Fish shared with Council that the parks faced an operational funding gap that just could not be fixed with one-time Band-Aid fixes. A little over a year ago, the Council made a very difficult decision to reduce the parks budget, but we also directed the Bureau to begin addressing the longer-term structural issues. The Bureau worked over the summer and into the fall of 2019 with a group of community members who served on what we called the Alternative Funding Task Force, with the support of both the Trust for Public Land as well as Portland State University. And then in November, Commissioner Fish and Director Long led a City Council work session where we reviewed the state of the parks situation, the system that we have today, the one we want to have in the years ahead, and what the pathways were to get there. Portland Parks and Recreation provided us 3 basic scenarios. First of all, what would happen to the system overall if we just maintained the current funding level? That would be a decline in service over the next 15 years. What it would take to prevent that decline and continue to deliver approximately the same level of service, and what it would take to deliver on a system that's truly equitable and accessible for all Portlanders. It was clear at that work session that Portland Parks and Recreation is underfunded to provide the service levels that we believe the community and the City Council had identified over time, like walkability to a park, for example. And the attending commissioners, myself included, made it really clear that a declining system just was not an option. The people in the city love their parks too much. Since then, the Bureau has continued its sustainable future effort, recommending next steps for the council to address these specific challenges. The 3 areas where the Bureau faces the most significant financial challenges are these. First, parks is overly reliant on a fee-based structure. In recent years, for every dollar that it spends, more than a quarter comes from program fees, permits, and the like. In the recreational services division, for example, parks has typically earned between 40 and 50 cents of every single dollar directly from patrons. This dependence on fees means that in order to create a balanced budget, fee increases need to keep pace with cost increases. But conflicting with that is the need to keep the programs affordable and accessible, and that just hasn't happened. And yet, for some Portlanders, especially Portlanders of color and East Portland residents, the cost is still a barrier, and that's according to a survey conducted by the Bureau recently. The second challenge, parks operations and maintenance are continually underfunded. As Portland's population has continued to increase and as our parks and recreation system has been used more intensely, the investment in operations and maintenance in the system just hasn't been able to keep up. Parks has less staff working in developed parks right now than it did 10 years ago. Parks has 1.2 million trees, and it's not able to do preventative maintenance because it only has 12 arborists for 1.2 million trees. Parks has over 470 community park structures, things like community centers, pools, maintenance facilities, public restrooms, picnic shelters, and it just can't keep up with the required ongoing maintenance. The third challenge is the park's capital maintenance backlog. And this is not unique to parks, but it's particularly egregious here. Portland has a 100-year-old park and recreation system, so there's a lot of old capital there. It needs over $450 million in direct identified capital maintenance. Taking on this lack of reinvestment in our physical infrastructure is going to take many, many years and a large infusion of capital resources. And that's despite the fact that we did the Build PDX program that allocates significant new resources to city infrastructure, including parks infrastructure. And the Bureau's sustainable future effort, it's a long-term one. It's focused on closing the gaps between expectations of the community and the resources we have on the other hand. And addressing this deferred major maintenance gap is a core part of that long-term work plan. While the Bureau has been clarifying and problem solving these issues over time, COVID-19 has obviously exacerbated these challenges. The Bureau is effectively earning no program revenues and has experienced increased demands on its operations and its maintenance teams. And in fact, as we respond to COVID and we try to serve vulnerable populations, particularly those on the streets, we are increasing expenditures and increasing needs by opening those facilities to people who are the most vulnerable and the most exposed to the risk of COVID.
Thank you for that very thoughtful answer. So it seems like the Portland Park and Recreations have two basic sources of money: the fees that you were talking about, which provide a significant portion, and then the general fund or money, other monies from the city. How do you make that balance between what is fee driven and what is money from other city funds?
Excuse me, I actually wanted to comment because we are not universally of the same mind about this particular initiative.
Okay.
So if I may.
Okay, sure.
While we, in fact, have lost significant revenue for parks due to COVID, I was very disappointed that what I thought was coming back to the council was a long-term sustainability plan for parks. And instead, what we actually ended up with was first a letter that went out to the community saying, if you don't pass this, we aren't going to have parks programs. The reality is we won't have parks programs for a couple of years because we don't have a plan for how we're going to have parks programs during COVID-19. What we know is we won't be gathering in community centers for the traditional parks programs. What we know is people won't be in pools as they have been prior to COVID-19. And so I just want to be clear that we are not all universally on the same page when it comes to what my expectations were and what we were presented to at City Council. I was looking for a long-term plan, and this is a quick fix in my view, and it doesn't deal with the fundamental issues, is that we don't have a comprehensive plan about how, in fact, we are going to fund parks moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. That's kind of relevant to my question is, there's some policy decisions that are going on behind this measure.
So as Commissioner Hardesty, this is Amanda Fritz, Commissioner Hardesty just pointed out this is a stopgap measure. That's absolutely right. It is that we were hoping to bring something more significant and more sustainable. In fact, something that would raise $100 million a year, which is actually what is needed for the park system that we all want. That could have gone forward except for COVID. And so as we have had to lay off so many people, we are providing some programming. Director Long could speak to that as to what's being done virtually and encouraging people to be out. Obviously, the park spaces are open and in need of maintenance and funding. So there's that. This is an interim step, and the sustainability plan is still moving forward. So this is not the only thing that's necessary. Director Long, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. I would just add to Commissioner Fritz's comments, even despite COVID, Portland Parks and Recreation has continued to rise to the challenge to serve the community. We are indeed offering virtual programming. We've had Fitness in the Park, which has been physically distanced outside fitness programming. We're rolling out a virtual preschool program. We've continued to do our volunteer work in the programs. Community gardens are open, parks, Portland Tennis Center is open, golf is open. So we are not closed by any stretch of the imagination, but COVID has definitely has limited our reach as it relates to community centers because of the limitation of the amount of people that are allowed in gathered indoor spaces, and also our ability to serve them in the community centers with our limited staff resources at this time.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on Director Long and Commissioner Fritz's comments. Look, there's no funding stream that's certain in the current environment, and we can't bind the decisions of future councils. We know that too, and it's my intention to continue to treat the general fund component of PP&R on par with other general fund bureaus. That's sort of a given. While the levy might assist the bureau in a scenario where all the city bureaus are taking a general fund reduction to balance the city's budget, I won't use the levy to free up general fund for other resources. I think that's important to note. And it's also important to note that the decision to move this to the ballot was not so much a political decision as it was a decision driven by the reality of our fiscal situation. Either we want to support the park system and we're looking for the park system to be supported and we find the best of the options that are available, or we defer this again. But if we defer this again, I just want to be really clear. As we go by day, there are parks facilities that are not being appropriately maintained, critical taxpayer-owned infrastructure that is falling apart, and access to resources that is not being uniformly shared with equity across our community. And so, nobody wants to raise taxes. I don't think anybody got elected saying, I can't wait to raise taxes. I think the goal here is to be good stewards of what is the most beloved asset in our city, which is our park system. And this council is taking that chance collectively. Doesn't mean we all agree on everything. We don't, and we don't have to necessarily agree on everything. But from my perspective, I'll speak to this. I don't see a better option. And this is, I've had to propose 4 budgets in a row now. And in each and every one of those budgets, I've had to cut back the resources to the Parks Bureau. And I'll tell you, there's nothing that draws more ire from the public than when they see us do this and they wonder why we aren't finding a solution to help them fund the parks. And last year, we even had a bunch of people come in and say, why haven't you even asked us? Ask us to support the parks. We're happy to do it, and we will.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'll turn over the question to question number 2.
Yeah, I think it's a good transition point. Mayor Wheeler, you just mentioned briefly about the commitment from the general fund, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to comment further. I know the city currently invests a little over $90 million in general fund expenditures in the annual parks budget for basic park services. How are you going to assure voters that the city will maintain that financial commitment for underlying parks programs and that the levy won't replace that funding?
Yeah, and good question. While it's true that the Portland Parks and Recreation general fund budget, it's over $90 million. In fact, it was closer to $100 million last year. Only about $76 million of that total amount's made up of tax resources, or what we on the council refer to as general fund discretionary. The remainder is, as mentioned earlier, made up of fees to customers, charges that other bureaus pay for services, and then there's sort of a long list of miscellaneous funding sources. The council referred this levy in order to both preserve and enhance parks and recreation services and manage our physical and green assets responsibly. And I'm obviously committed to that effort going forward.
Within the conversation about reducing fees to the extent possible, do you have projected amounts of about $26 million or $20+ million is provided by fees. Do we know to what extent the levy will be able to reduce that fee revenue or replace that fee revenue?
Let's have Director Long answer that question because we had some discussion about it. And, you know, as I mentioned, it does depend on the equity analysis and what the community directs us to do. But Director Long, if you could speak to that question, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. Harmony, so while we're not looking to eliminate fees altogether, we certainly want to lower the barrier for participation. And we've been looking at different approaches and we'll continue to have conversation with the community and others about what is the best approach, but we've been thinking about sliding scale, other progressive different fee schedules for different folks. So we haven't zeroed in on exactly what the approach is. I don't imagine that anything will be completely free, but we do want to make sure that the most vulnerable in our community and the people who need our services the most, that cost isn't a barrier for them to participate.
If I may jump in, this is Commissioner Hardesty. I would just like to add, when we were threatening to close community pools, we heard from a lot of community members that they could pay more. And they were willing to pay more, but we've done absolutely nothing to actually get them to pay more as of yet. And so again, my concern is I think this was really rushed to the ballot because of fear, and certainly was not enough internal conversation about why doing this at this moment, knowing the economic devastation that many of our community members are facing, knowing that on this particular ballot, there's about $15 billion in new taxes from lots of governments. I just feel that without a plan for what we're going to do, both short-term and long-term, that this was a ill thought out process. And I was very disappointed that it did not do what I was told that the Director of Parks told me that she was doing, which was developing a long-term plan for sustainability for the parks. To me, it is a short-term, a gap funding, but with no plan for what programming looks like over this 5 years, no planning about how we're going to have people who can afford to pay more. And I think it does a disservice to the voters when we send something to the ballot that we have not fully flushed out just because we have budget deficits. As you may know, the city of Portland has faced in a $75 million budget deficit as of the beginning of this fiscal year, which meant every department within the city had to cut money out of their budget. And we did not spare first responders, which is traditionally what you do in an economic downturn, because we felt the pain must be felt citywide, and we had to share that perspective. And so, again, I just don't want the conversation to be one-sided because, again, we're all individually elected and we all come to this from very different perspectives.
Commissioner Hardesty, you might look at it like the ballot measure that we all agreed to refer for the police accountability, where there's a set amount for the for how much would be funded in that, but that's the overall framework, and there's going to be more details worked out later. So this is similar to that we know we need more money. We know that we didn't have time to do a full comprehensive community process, and so we're asking the voters to approve the stopgap measure with the pledge that we're going to do that full inclusive process so that we're not having top-down decisions, rather we're taking the time to engage the community.
I appreciate that, but from what I've seen so far, I'm not confident that that's going to happen.
Well, we appreciate the multiple perspectives. I'll go ahead and pass to Mark for the next question.
Yes, I have the next question. In working through the materials you provided us, we noticed that there was a difference between the rate that the Bureau chose of 0.80 per thousand for the levy versus what the projection is, an effective rate of 0.66. Can you explain that to us?
I'm going to ask Sarah Huggins to explain that because she's our financial expert.
Good afternoon. This is Sarah Huggins. I'm an analyst with Portland Parks. So nearly a year ago in the Parks Financial Sustainability Work Session, City Council encouraged the Bureau to seek additional funding so they could end the trend of declining services, rectify inequitable service delivery, and meet service levels the community has expected from their parks and recreation system. We modeled the cost to deliver those service levels, and in late May, we conducted some public polling. As part of the effort, we looked at voters' willingness to pay for different levy amounts, and there was very little change in voter support at the different levy rates that we polled. And the 80-cent rate would enable delivery of the services, as we described, as opposed to a reduced set of services. We're projecting an effective rate of 66 cents due to compression. And compression is particular to Oregon and is a consequence of two ballot measures from the 90s. We hired the Portland State University Northwest Economic Research Center to estimate the amount of compression and what other local option levies would be compressed as a result of this local option levy if it's passed by voters. And their analysis indicated that for a rate of 80 cents per $1,000 of assessed value, the effective rate would be 66 cents per $1,000 due to compression.
Very clear. Thank you.
And compression was what was on my mind for our next question. The C in TSCC is for conservation, but with the state property tax control measures, compression became an area that we've been interested in and have to take into consideration when we look at these measures. Your material and the resolution authorizing this levy talked about the impact specifically on your own children's levy, on the county's levy for the Historical Society, and on Metro Parks levy. You also talked about holding the children's levy harmless by a direct payment, and we're looking to mitigate the impact on others. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. And you're right. For some people, some taxpayers, this isn't going to increase their taxes. It's going to change the way the pie is sliced. So in the resolution, the council acknowledged the compression impact and resolved to mitigate the impacts. Specifically, we resolved to make an appropriation in the annual budget from the Parks Local Option Levy Fund to the Children's Investment Fund for changes in revenue caused by compression. Since many of our parks programs are aimed at helping families and children, it wouldn't make sense to rob from Peter to pay Paul. So we want to make sure that, as you mentioned, the children's levy is held harmless, or the children's fund, as I think we now call it. The Bureau will also work with Metro and the Historical Society to transfer funds or identify another method to mitigate the compression impact. The Act, which is part of the ballot submission, included the authority for levy funds to be used for grants to other jurisdictions or other city programs to mitigate the impacts of property tax compression.
Thank you. Clearly, the impact on the children's levy is substantially more than the others. According to one of the charts that was provided to us as part of your ballot measure, it looks to me like it averages about $500,000 a year for over each of the 5 years, which is a substantial amount. What will be but you indicate that the source of funds for that will be directly in levy funds, is that correct?
Yes.
And if that is the case, did you express that in the ballot measures, in the ballot material that was submitted to the elections office? When I looked at the summary and the ballot explanatory statement, I wasn't sure that I could pierce through the language to see where that was an intended use.
I'll let staff to speak to that. I wasn't in charge of.
If I could jump in on that, then I'll let staff speak. It actually comes out of the general fund, so it is not necessarily specifically coming out of the levy itself.
Sorry, I misspoke. The mayor was the parks. I'm sorry. The mayor was the Parks Commissioner when this was referred, and so he's obviously more familiar with it. But, yeah, thank you.
That's what I was hoping the answer was. Thank you very much.
I have the next question. So the ballot measure lists 5 primary purposes for the measure. Briefly put, they are to enhance and preserve parks, provide park and recreation services to diverse populations, increase opportunities for communities of color and children, prevent cuts to recreation programs and community centers, and enhance park maintenance to keep parks clean and safe. And we're really interested in, as representatives for the public, what you're thinking in terms of the allocation between these 5 purposes and how you'll make those decisions if they change year over year throughout the life of the levy.
Really good question, and one that I asked myself. Some of you will remember that I was the Parks Commissioner when we referred the bond measure in 2014, and that was really different, where we had very specific promises of what we were going to do and then worked through them over the course of the bond measure. As I mentioned a little earlier, this one is different because of the rapid way we had to act because of COVID, and so we are pledging to partner with the community to recommend spending for the council to consider in the budget process. And so before committing the council to specific amounts for the first year or even for 5 years, the Bureau is going to have continued community listening sessions to learn more about how it can best meet community needs, especially historically underserved communities such as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as low-income communities and areas of the city that have not previously had particularly good park services. So the specific fund allocations would occur during the budget processes, where council would review and decide on allocations each year. We don't want to preempt future budget processes. What we hear from our community partners may change future recommendations. But for example, for a sense of scale, on average, the levy would be estimated to raise about 48 million, as I mentioned. We're thinking about 2/3 would be spent on operating and maintaining parks, natural areas and trees, keeping the parks cleaner, safer, more welcoming for all, planting new trees in low canopy areas, and performing work in the natural areas that ensures clean water, protects wildlife, and diminishes the impacts of climate change. That area of parks operations has been historically challenged and underfunded. And that, as Mayor Wheeler mentioned, the work session that we held last year with Commissioner Fish, the desire to look after the urban forest was definitely high on a lot of people's list. About 1/3 of it, the levy that we're proposing would be used to provide recreation programs that would reduce dependency on fees. So for some people, there would potentially be no fee. For others, there could be a sliding scale. And then for folks who are able to pay more, we can look at that as well. That already does occur in different areas of town where the community centre fees are structured somewhat differently based on the community's ability to pay. But we currently don't have a robust scholarship program. It's dependent on the Parks Foundation raising money, which sometimes is able to be done, and sometimes philanthropists don't donate to that. So that's something that we hope to amend with this levy to serve currently underserved Portlanders and provide funding to safely reopen the community centres and pools and resume programming.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing, I appreciate kind of the broad buckets and roughly what might be allocated to each. I also heard at the beginning of your answer, Commissioner Fritz, that it's going to try to be as a community-driven process as possible, and I think that is really important and is some of what Commissioner Hardesty's been raising throughout this. I wondered if the council or Director Long might be able to speak a little bit about how you're picturing that community engagement process looking in this COVID world. Having been to a number of public meetings and other forums myself, I do think that it has changed a little bit. And I imagine in the past when you would do community outreach with respect to parks, it was probably, in the facilities and at the parks themselves where you were catching a kind of wider berth of people who are at least using the services. Not that that's the only, people who care about parks, but with new kind of online engagement, it does seem in some ways that it attracts kind of more of the advocates or people who have like a specific, issue that they really want to force. And I just wondered how the city was going to approach making sure that, a real kind of representative slice of the community gets to weigh in on this really important issue of how a lot of money will be allocated to our park system.
Well, I'll pass it over to staff in just a minute. Whoever, it looks like maybe Todd's going to speak to Todd Loughran, the Deputy Director, wants to speak to that. I will also note that, yes, for sure, in a normal summer, I would have been going to several community events a week, the parades, the summers, and the events in the park. We would have had booths, so the people just wandering around. I would be, basically talking to anybody I came up to tell them about this and about the process. That clearly is not happening. I'm still doing the neighborhood association and other community meetings, which in some cases they are getting better participation with the opportunity to be virtual. That obviously with the digital divide, we know that some people are left out of that process. And as you say, James, there's often a tendency for the loudest voices and the strongest advocates to get themselves signed up early and make their points known. So we're definitely mindful of the challenges. Actually, the Water Bureau has also been doing a fair amount of public engagement related to the filtration plant that we're building. And so I think that it's hard to believe it's only been 6 months. I think we are getting better at figuring out alternative ways to reach people. But Todd, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that the Bureau historically has had a really strong community engagement program. And one of the things that we're doing in the virtual world is having simultaneous translation on our virtual platforms. So we're able to, for instance, we're having a meeting next week in Vietnamese. And so we'll be definitely having targeted outreach to make sure that we have the multilingual, multicultural approach. But also a really important benefit of the levy funding is to enhance our community engagement capacity so we can give direct community grants to culturally specific organizations that are consolidating input that we as government are not reaching, that they can bring community voices and have a community-centered approach both to program design, whether, how does a person feel welcome in a park, to one of our community centers, to having access to our programs. And so we're really excited to be in a position where we could be giving community grants to culturally specific organizations and geographic-based organizations to help inform us as a city service.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I have the next question. Does the Bureau have performance measures for this, for all of these purposes? And will the Bureau differentiate between deficit reduction spending and program enhancement spending?
Commissioner Fritz, you might be on mute.
I decided I wasn't going to mute, and then I did and forgot. Thank you, Todd. I'd like maybe some discussion about what we mean by deficit reduction spending and program enhancement spending. To answer the first question, we certainly will be having performance metrics to assess its services, track the access, participation, demographics, the location of tree planting efforts and canopy. We've come a long way since we established the City Budget Office in 2012 or 2013. The city has really moved a lot more to performance metrics and gauges its success on that. And we will certainly be transparent about how levy funds are spent. We would, with the oversight committee and the annual audits, and then the reporting to council every year, describe the services we've provided, the outcomes, the metrics. So if by enhancements you mean that parks would fund operating and maintenance of parks and keeping them cleaner and safer and more welcoming, about two-thirds of the levy funding would be for enhancements. And if by deficits you mean that the parks would provide recreation programs without a dependency on fees or restored lost fee revenue with the levy, about a third would be spent on deficit. But if you'd like to clarify a little more about what deficit reduction and program enhancement was, what's meant by that, please.
I'll make an attempt at it, and I'll let my fellow commissioners correct me if I'm wrong. I think the background and the history of the park system is that there's a structural deficit. So I think we're interested in being able to track to what extent the levy balances the budget, right? Like fills the gap of that structural deficit versus adding new programming, shifting programming, changing what we do, what the park system does and how it serves Portland and its residents. And I'll let another commissioner correct me if I need more clarity.
Thank you. So, sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Norton. Did you have something to comment?
Oh, no, this is Commissioner Berenger. I was just saying, I think she has the question correct. Yes.
So, clearly it's to address partly the structural deficit that it will reduce the reliance on fees. It looks like Deputy Director Todd Lofgren has another answer for us.
No, you had it. You had it. I was just going to say that the mayor outlined the three challenges for you: the reliance on fees, the operation and maintenance being underfunded, and the levy directly solves for those issues. And so, taking the Bureau off of this reliance of fees, enhancing our operation and maintenance funding so we can take better care of our community park structures, community centers, pools, maintenance facilities, our green infrastructure, trees, natural areas that we have across the city. All of those will be better taken care of, as well as then the preventive maintenance or elongating the life of the capital assets that we have. It will not solve the capital maintenance backlog problem.
Right. So as I mentioned, it's $48 million a year, and the need is about $100 million a year to properly fund parks. So it's a beginning, and included in the parks budget this year is ongoing work on the sustainability plan that is certainly still needed. So this is, as Todd mentioned, the levy is written in such a way that it doesn't fund major maintenance capital improvements. Now, we did make some headway into that over the past many years, or several years, by requiring that half of all of the one-time money that's left at the end of the year has to be spent on major maintenance in parks, transportation, and emergency management. So Parks has received, I believe, I'm guessing I think it's about $70 million through that major maintenance account. Still, our assets are 100 years old, and we have 450 million. So even that dedication, which we've tried to be fiscally responsible, is not enough to catch up. The bond measure certainly helped as well.
I'd like to weigh in on this question as well, Commissioner. And let me say, I am a strong advocate for parks. I don't want anything that I say to come off as anti-parks and I hate parks. That is not the case at all. But I think the honest answer to your question is this is not doing anything to get us to where we need to be. The reality is that we don't know financially what kind of minefields we're going to be facing as we come out of this pandemic. And this is, in fact, a short-term solution to a systemic problem that the city has had for quite some time. And I will not today say that the Parks Bureau will get the same amount of general fund funding that they have been receiving in the past, because we will be forced to make some really tough choices. And so I can see a scenario where Parks will get less general fund money because they have gone out and just put this levy on the ballot. In my mind, without a real plan for what happens programmatically while we're in this pandemic and how we're going to actually start building for the future, I think it is a misnomer to say that any enhancements will be taking place, because we're not in an enhancement stage. We are basically in a running in place stage. But there's no there should be no expectation from any bureau within the city of Portland that they will maintain whatever funding they have today from the general fund.
I guess I have the next question. Harmony, if you're ready to move on. Okay.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, so there's a new fund that's been is going to be developed that will take the expenditures from this levy. Should the voters vote it in, you'll continue to get general funds, and in addition, you'd have these levy funds. So we're interested in hearing about how you're going to differentiate a local option expenditure from a general fund expenditure in this fund.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll take this one up. So local option levy resources are restricted based on ballot language, and all the resources are going to be deposited in a separate fund for both tracking and compliance purposes. All non-levy eligible expenditures are expected to continue to be funded in the general fund or by other eligible sources. Since the levy is intended to preserve and enhance existing services and address gaps in service and access, many expenditures will be eligible for both general fund as well as levy funding. In those instances, we would expect to use general fund sources first, preserving voter-approved resources as much as possible. We're going to, as you heard, have a robust engagement oversight structure around the use of the funding, including a public oversight committee, annual audits, and the annual review and approval with council to allocate resources to eligible expenses.
Okay, thank you. I don't have a follow-up for that.
Oh, all right, then let's move on and talk about East Portland. I think Commissioner Fritz mentioned one of the community surveys. All of your community surveys, each year when you do them, shows a difference between citywide and when you look at East Portland specifically in terms of how far away from neighborhood parks, how far away from community centers, whether there are sidewalks to walk on to go to the parks, how people feel safe in the parks. There's always a difference in East Portland. That's not just for park services. I'm sure it's for other city services as well. Last week when we heard the library measure, the library has specifically targeted some of its activities to East Portland. So this makes us wonder, what about this local option levy? What about East Portland? What can you tell us?
Well, this is one I actually do know the number, and that is that we invested over $70 million in new parks in East Portland while I was the Parks Commissioner. So $70 million in 5 years. That was mostly system development charge money. So again, if we hadn't done that, I would have been reluctant to have voted to refer this measure because it's for maintenance of parks. So if you don't have any parks, you're not going to get them maintained. And the lack of equitable services in East Portland is something that is owned and shared by the council, and if supporters, if the levy passes, it will absolutely be our priority. So we have built new parks in East Portland, and notably Gateway Discovery, Lewitville View, and the other one I'm blanking on the name on. And then there are, thank you very much, the Thomas Cully Park. For a while there, we were just doing so many glorious things in partnership with the community, which we've also worked to make sure that the community is much more engaged, and indeed that we're employing people from the community and building the new parks. There's others are coming online. Park Lane Park is the easternmost park that I think that we have. It's very near the Gresham border, and they've been waiting for their community facilities for literally decades. So that is now funded and will get done. Gateway Green is getting done. Mill Park, Gateway Green is the bicycle facility, which is really exciting in between the freeways in Gateway. And then Mill Park, we did a master plan on that, and we're going to be able to get that constructed as well. So there are now a number, and plus the 2014 bond measure did parks improvements in many parks in East Portland, and put play equipment in parks that didn't have any. So that I'm really proud of the work that we've done there. And the levy funding would continue to address some of the disparities. And actually, particularly, we have some facilities. We've got the East Portland Community Center, which is really important, and so is Montebilla. And so there in particular, the surrounding communities are not able to pay for the fees for the swim lessons and for the use of the facility, so that the levy will make sure that the cost is not a barrier there. We are very much aware of the lack of trees in East Portland. We've done some work to try to protect the ones that are still there, and we'll continue that work over the next several years, and particularly for the rest of this year. But we have a program to plant trees in low canopy, low income neighborhoods. We just recently advertised that we were going to give away 1,500 fruit trees, and the program was set up to make sure that it was offered first, and that the low income communities not only got prioritized, but got there were neighborhoods in East Portland where the trees were delivered for them. And I know that Friends of Trees, who I volunteer with quite a lot with Portland Parks, also has prioritized that. And then there's also, Todd mentioned the community specific. A lot of our immigrant and refugee communities and culturally specific communities live or have their operations in East Portland. So that the teen program, the Youth Conservation Corps, the work with Latino Network, the events like Stand With Immigrants and Refugees and the Tongan Festival, all of these things, the festivals we really miss. We installed some football courts in East Portland as well, and those require maintenance over time. So there is certainly significant amounts of parks now in East Portland that is going to need funding, and it would be absolutely tragic to give East Portland some of the parks that they deserve, and then turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, we can't maintain them. We're not going to be able to provide the programming. So that's what this levy will help address.
Thank you. You raise an important point. Certainly with the prior measure to provide for expansion of park services, and you just talked about the difference between new park lands, development, capital development of park lands, and then the ultimate burden of O&M. Is there a natural limit to acquiring new parks?
Not
because
when the
O&M costs?
No. There may be I mean, obviously we don't have enough money to invest to give parks where there already are some, but everybody pays property taxes, and in fact, East Portland pays disproportionately more property taxes compared with their value because of how Measure 5 was set up. So for us to then turn around and say, sorry, we can't afford the operations and maintenance, so we're not going to correct the deficit. I'm, as you know, probably retiring at the end of this year, but if any council in the future did that, as long as I'm alive, I will be there screaming quite, I would be advocating that they not do that. And I know that my colleagues who are going to continue on the council would not do that either. So we do have a policy that when a new park comes on board or comes into operations, it gets an allocation from the general fund, an ongoing allocation for operations and maintenance. There's sometimes some discussion on the council of whether the number that parks and the budget office decide is the correct number, whether it is the correct number. And when Commissioner Novick was on the council, he was often advocated for giving less than had been calculated. And when I was the Parks Commissioner, we looked into how the charges are calculated, because I knew that Commissioner Novick was going to challenge me on it. So I wanted to make sure that the numbers were defensible. And so I believe that our methodology now is entirely defensible.
Thank you.
Mayor Wheeler, did you have a point you wanted to make?
I just wanted to say I'm really sorry, but at 3 p.m. the council is needed for city council. So I don't know if there are some burning issues that need to be addressed.
James, do you want to do your question or should I do mine?
I think yours might be a little bit more burning.
Okay, I'll do that one. This will be our final question then. The levy is for a 5-year period, and you've always made a good point about using 1-year money for 1-year type of expenses, or money that you get unexpectedly, use it just not for sustainable costs. But what is your plans for this one after the 5 years are over?
Well, as we've discussed today, I see this really as a first step towards building a sustainable future for our city's parks and recreation system. That's clearly the goal, and we're going to continue to explore as a council, working with the community, whatever options are available for permanent funding for the parks. Other funding options that the council considered last November included a special district. We looked at a prepared food and beverage tax. We looked at an income tax. We looked at a general obligation bond, amongst other possibilities. So I believe the Parks Bureau and community partners did a very, very thorough job of prepping and then identifying the specific mechanism that we're putting forward to the ballot. We're going to continue to work to identify long-term funding plans for the Bureau. And a future City Council, of course, could decide to refer to the voters a different funding mechanism to support PP&R service levels if they so choose. They could refer to the voters an option to renew a levy in 5 years. And obviously that would be highly contingent upon us doing what we say we're going to do and delivering on the promises of this particular levy. They could realign city resources to provide increased support for parks. In other words, we could cut other bureaus' budgets in order to prioritize parks. Or finally, we could certainly reduce park service levels. That's basically the suite of options that are available to us or to a future council. I remain highly confident in Director Adina Long's leadership of the Bureau to inform the community and future city councils of the best options for Portland's parks and recreation systems. Nothing is permanent, nothing is forever, nothing is in stone, but this levy is as solid as any levy that has ever been referred to the ballot, including frankly, some things that this council has referred to the ballot in the past. There are some I's to be dotted, some T's to be crossed, but most of the picture is clearly filled in here.
Great, thank you. Craig, has anyone signed up to provide public comment? You might be on mute.
No, Chair, no one has, but I have received a document from a committee that is called Communications for Parks, and I will enter that into the record.
Okay, great, thank you. That then concludes our questions in this hearing. Thank you all for participating and for your thoughtful comments and providing your insight into this measure. With that, I will close the hearing. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. And Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you. Best of luck.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.